con l'intervento di Chris Musson. Il tema, lo ricordo, è l'archeologia del paesaggio e l'innovazione tecnologica nel nuovo millennio. Allo stesso tema concorrerà poi l'intervento di Guaitoli non appena arriverà.
Buongiorno. Il mio dovere è anzitutto portare a tutti voi le più sincere scuse di Robert Bewley, che è stato trattenuto inaspettatamente e all'ultimo minuto a Londra. È profondamente dispiaciuto di non essere presente ad onorare la memoria di Riccardo. Su sua richiesta leggerò io sue riflessioni, purtroppo in inglese, perché né Robert né io so parlare o scrivere italiano. È un onore condividere l'intervento con il professor Guaitoli, il cui volume, Lo sguardo di Icaro, mostra con estrema chiarezza la posizione preeminente di questo paese nell'uso della fotografia aerea, soprattutto verticale, nella ricerca archeologica e per la tutela. E poi, fortunatamente per me, magari anche per voi, in inglese. Dr. Bewley and I will approach the subject, we do approach the subject from a slightly different angle, that of oblique air photography from light aircraft, undertaken by archaeologists themselves for purposes of exploration, interpretation, conservation, and public presentation. We speak, I should say, on behalf of a group of visiting archaeologists and pilots who've come to know and love Italy and its aerial archaeology during the past decade. Particularly, I would think of Otto Brasch from Germany, Daria Grossman from Slovenia, and a group of other members of the International Aerial Archaeology Research Group. Our hosts and key collaborators in Italy have been Riccardo Francovich in Siena, Giuliano Volpe in Foggia, Giuseppe Ceraldo, and Paul Arthur in Lecce, along, of course, with their colleagues and research students in each case. It was Riccardo Francovich who, in one way or another, brought most of us here to Italy. During his own visits to England, he had seen how aerial survey by archaeologists themselves could uncover the unseen and half-seen traces of the past. And it was Riccardo in Italy who created the fondly remembered summer schools at Pontignano. At one of these schools in 1991, two of us came from the United Kingdom to talk about exploratory air survey as a method capable of serving a wide variety of purposes. The message then raised little enthusiasm, I'm afraid, not least because Italy was still restricted by a 1939 law which made it extremely difficult for all but a few adventurous Italian archaeologists to take to the air in pursuit of their art. That wasn't enough to deter Riccardo, however. And by the time I returned in 1999, he was already working with Piero Spagna and others on a new law which, from December 2000, gave Italy the open skies, which were or had recently become a reality across most of Northern and Central Europe. With his customary foresight, Riccardo suggested to me there and then the idea of an Italian research and training school on mainly oblique photography and interpretation and mapping. To our frank surprise, I think, a group of us from Italy and beyond managed to bring this to fruition in September 2001 at Siena. Other schools have followed at Foggia, Grosseto, and elsewhere in Europe. And international cooperation in this field has grown in a way that delighted both Riccardo and those of us who shared his dream of encouraging the wider use of our kind of air photography in Italy. So can we look to the future, as Riccardo always did? Can we see a growing use in Italy and elsewhere of what we might call free-ranging exploratory air survey for archaeological and landscape research? And, of course, for conservation work and for communication with politicians, heritage professionals, and the general public. Hopefully so, because without winning over legislators and the public at large, we cannot claim the right to receive public or private funds to protect the traces of the past from unwitting or uncaring destruction. Riccardo, of course, was never afraid of talking to politicians. For a moment, however, let's go back to Britain in the mid-1970s, when a few forward-looking archaeologists reacted to the uncontrolled destruction that was taking place in our medieval town centres and along our growing motorway system. The call to conscience issued then brought about a kind of rescue archaeology revolution, turning us irrevocably to the recovery within a broadly research-based framework of what was about to be destroyed, rather than cutting into sites that were endangered by no one but ourselves. To make it possible to identify the endangered sites, we had first to produce for planning authorities at local and regional and national level reliable and easily consulted registers of archaeological sites and finds, against which development proposals could be evaluated. Hence there grew up a countrywide coverage of county-based, municipal or regional sites and monuments records, as we call them, identifying the location and essential character of all known archaeological sites and casual finds. Through use of these now fully computerized records, planning authorities and infrastructure agencies, most of them now employing their own conservation archaeologists, seek to strike a balance between present-day needs and the survival or loss of irreplaceable evidence from the past. These processes now save vast numbers of endangered sites from damage and destruction each year. Little could have been done, however, without those basic records, nor indeed without central government policy establishing a presumption against destruction wherever development could be avoided or carried out in less damaging ways. Will Italy, in the coming decades, be able to achieve similar goals within its very different administrative, political, and academic structures? If so, that would be one of the most important innovations of the new century. Achieving that balance could itself have an enormous impact on ideas about landscape archaeology, as we're beginning to see in Britain. In fact, this kind of planned rescue work is beginning to revolutionize ideas about the realities and interpretation of the past. The principle has now been firmly established that the developer must pay for any necessary rescue archaeology. And as a result, we now have in Britain large-scale archaeological investigations along the lines of new communication routes and gas pipelines. These infrastructure projects cut huge transects across the countryside, bringing us as archaeologists into contact with parts of the landscape that we would not in the past have had the resources, or perhaps we should say the initiative, to investigate. This kind of work, involving a whole range of investigative techniques in addition to excavation, is showing us with startling clarity that the spaces between our known monuments, those white areas which invalidate so many archaeological distribution maps are not emptinesses at all, but spaces full of activity of all ages and often of unexpected types. This is forcing us, and will force us even more in the future, to make fundamental reassessments of some long-established ideas about settlement, landscapes, economies, and societies in the past. Perhaps this is already happening in Italy too. If so, or if it happens in the future, this too will become one of the most important innovations of the coming decades. Turning briefly to aerial archaeology itself, there is the essential but time-consuming task of converting millions of aerial images, vertical, oblique, satellite-based, or whatever, into readily intelligible, mapped, visualized, and text-based records for sites of all types and all periods in all parts of the country. Perhaps the digital revolution and GIS will help us to do this more quickly and efficiently, but there will always remain the matching tasks of interpretation and evaluation, without which the cycle of understanding, valuation, and care cannot become complete. Already, however, we have the capacity, through the desk-based technology of the present day, to record and to communicate to others the basic character in mapped and text-based form of all types of features of all ages, detectable through the analysis of aerial photographs, both vertical and oblique. In England, this enormous task is now one-third complete, but I have to say one-third complete after nearly 2 decades of work. Might something similar be considered in Italy, helping to establish the true scale and character of the country's patrimony and encouraging the growth of academic and public understanding of its value and fragility? I'm sure Riccardo would have had something to say on that. We will, of course, see advances in technology, not least in the use of a more sophisticated satellite and other forms of remote sensing. But one of these, airborne laser scanning, or LiDAR, has already begun to revolutionize what we can do and the kind of questions that we can ask in landscape archaeology. LiDAR can create centimetrically accurate digital models of the surface of the Earth at tolerably economical cost. With appropriate post-processing too, it can see through the trees to record the Earth's surface and its surviving archaeology, where it lies hidden and in some ways protected under dense woodland, incapable of adequate recording by ground-based survey or traditional air photography. This seeming magic can open up previously inaccessible and archaeologically rich forested areas. For Italy, with 50% of its landmass covered in trees, this could be revelatory. That said, we would argue from Britain that the real advances in the coming century will not lie in magical new methods or in valuing one technique above another, but in creating mutually supportive partnerships between new and well-established techniques, from air photography through geophysics and other forms of remote sensing to traditional excavation, find studies, environmental archaeology, and documentary research. Of course, new techniques will play their part, but it is in these creative partnerships of the kind consistently promoted by Riccardo between techniques, people, and institutions at regional, national, and international levels that we should be seeking real advances in the coming years. Finally, and very much in the present, much of our work with our Italian colleagues over the past few years has been undertaken within Culture 2000 projects of the European Union. one of the aims of the present or just ending project has been to establish somewhere in Europe, on the continent certainly, a European centre for landscape, archaeology and remote sensing, to act as a virtual and occasionally physical focus for the continued promotion of pan-European research in conservation, graduate teaching, events and exchange of skills in aerial survey, remote sensing and landscape studies. One of Riccardo's last acts in this context was to offer Siena Grosseto as the home for this small but potentially significant new nerve centre. Typically of Riccardo, he emphasized in a way that really Riccardo only could emphasize, that he was absolutely not interested in the centre for its status or physical existence, but only as a means of furthering the growing network of expertise and international cooperation that the Culture 2000 project and his own lifetime's work personified. But Riccardo is gone, and the idea has matured in the last few months into a more flexible and sustainable concept of a network of centres of expertise around Europe, each contributing according to its own capacities to a central core of agreed values and objectives. It would be entirely fitting, I think, if the pioneering laboratory established by Riccardo Francovich and Stefano Campana and his colleagues at Grosseto were to become, in one of its manifestations, one of the first co-partners in that network, perhaps even for this aspect of its work, named in memory of Riccardo himself. Le ali per volare sono il dono più grande che Riccardo ha lasciato ai suoi allievi e colleghi italiani e stranieri. Alcuni hanno volato, altri no. Alcuni voleranno, altri no. Ma Riccardo ha offerto questa opportunità a tutti coloro che considerava meritevole del suo sostegno, a tutti coloro che avrebbero forse esplorato territori sconosciuti o sfiorato confini di orizzonti lontani. Oggi dobbiamo ricordarlo con gioia e dire semplicemente con animo sincero: grazie Riccardo, è stato un onore e un privilegio averti conosciuto. Grazie.